marketing is about emotion and influence. So if you can understand your customers inside and out, you can draw real insight that become the fuel for creative expressions that can create the influence and the emotion of storytelling.
Daz, I'm so thrilled to have you on the show with us today. And we've got a lot of meaty topics to cover that are spot on to our marketing executives who are listening to this and looking for encouragement and inspiration. And before we get too far into these big, heavy topics, I want to hear first thing, what are you most energized by? When you wake up in the morning, if you had to solve one problem in the world, what would it be?
Well, I don't know that I've ever had a world problem-solving vision in my life. But this morning, what got me out of bed and got me excited was seeing Bethany and doing a podcast. And then on other days, it's usually watching your podcast. So, but honestly, it's really, I'm just a curious person. And I wake up wondering what's happened in the last X number of hours, what's going to happen today, what's changed, what's different, and just in some way, shape and form, always learning. And everyone says you should always be learning. And true, that is true. But if you're just naturally curious, I don't know that I think of it as learning. I just think of that as breathing.
Interesting. It's more like lighthearted way where learning feels like you have to, I don't know, something heavier to me. But curious is just, okay, tell me more about that, right? And kind of that is where you guide your energy. That's really fascinating way to live.
Yeah, just being open.
Mm-hmm.
Just being open to everything and anything, I think, is that sense of, joy that I get from life.
Well, your curiosity has taken you far. You've had an incredible career background that we'll get into some different assignments that you've had in your chapters of your career that have shaped businesses that we all know and impacted the bottom line through marketing as the seat that you were sitting in a lot of cases as an executive. And so I want to first start on the topic that touches around kind of one of your mantras around vision and strategy integration. And so you emphasize the importance of integrating vision and strategy. And I'm curious how, as a leader, how do you go about that?
Yeah, I think first point would be that it is really an obvious leadership approach to have vision and strategy. I think there's not many leaders out there that wouldn't argue that that's core to the principle of leadership. But what I think is important and why I bring that up as a key characteristic of leadership in marketing is being diligent, because the daily grind is never ending, and that's why we call it a daily grind. And that can distract you from the bigger picture, or it can dilute it if they're not integrated. And so I believe that, strategy without vision really lacks inspiration, and then vision without strategy lacks a path to progress. And in business, you need both. I'm also a realist in business that recognizes that business actually respects performance that is measured through outcomes, not strategies, and certainly not through aspirations. Making sure that you're using vision as inspiration and fuel is, to me, the key. And if you get too far on either of those, that pendulum, you can lose your way, or you can be missing outcomes, or you can be diluted in your actual impact. So to me, it's as much a leadership mantra as it is a discipline to keep the two things together and recognize the value of both.
I love that perspective about where inspiration sits in that integration. I think it's a creative soul that would be the one to articulate that, like you. But I just find that interesting. I've never heard anybody articulate it like that. So thank you for that insight. And from a different angle on the same topic, how do you balance maintaining a strong vision while adapting to the rapidly changing marketing landscape? So you've set the course, you have the vision, you're fueled by the inspiration, you've got the strategy, but things are constantly shifting and changing, as we know. How do you, in your own leadership, reflecting back, or what would you say to a marketing leader who's feeling that tension?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, and it's one that we will never, ever get away. In fact, I just think it's a challenge that's getting continually harder because the marketplace, particularly in marketing, is continually moving. In fact, I heard someone the other day in a conversation change CMO to being because everything we work in is always in this perpetual state of change, where if you look at other dimensions of business, not so much. Laws of accounting haven't changed that much in the last 10 years. There's rules and bylaws and things like that, but fundamentals are different. Yeah. The fundamentals of marketing today are entirely different to what they were 5 years ago. And I'm not talking decades. Like last year, this year, the shift in the fundamentals of marketing is significant in terms of what we're dealing with. So I think to apply that integration of vision and strategy, you need consistency, flexibility, and of course that curiosity that I love. And the reason you need those things to get the value out of the integration is that if you aren't flexible, you won't be able to take opportunities as they come. And at the same time, if you're not focused on your goals and your vision, you're going to waste a lot of time, effort, energy, and money in the process. And so to me, I always think of approaching those opportunities which come every day. As CMO, there's barely a week or a day that doesn't go by that there's a new ad tech platform or a new approach that someone's trying to pitch you that can make your ROI improve, etc. So how do you apply that to critical decision making? And to me, it's oversimplified, to be honest, but the logic is how and why does this actually drive us towards our vision and goal? If it does, let's explore it. If we can't at that opening opportunity see that connection, see that red thread go through, we move on, because the good thing is there'll be another one tomorrow or the next day. So you can't hold yourself back by whether you should or you shouldn't. You just got to keep moving with that energy. Keep it aligned to your vision.
That's such a helpful perspective. And what an insightful, obvious in some way, but I've not heard it said that way, in that the different components of business, marketing is the one that is the most fluid in how fast it's changing. And I've heard someone say that people aren't afraid of change. They're afraid of the anxiety that change brings. So if you are a marketing leader, change management officer, I love that. You are managing that anxiety of your team, even trying to, balance, set the vision, align the strategy. Okay. All of these curveballs. And so it's the people side of it that I hear you saying in that change management officer, and those qualities that a successful marketing executive has to have is deeper into the emotional intelligence, more so because of these factors that you've listed. Interesting.
Yeah. And that's where having a vision and being able to articulate that consistency certainly helps team. Because whilst lots of things will change around your team and for the individuals in the team through their life, through to the organizational changes, the marketing changes and platforms. If you can keep everyone connected to that vision, it helps a tremendous amount to know that we're all together going after the same thing, even though everything around us can be different and moving all the time.
Love that. The painting the future state has to be the first step in all of that and make it really clear. So shifting gears a bit to another core component of your life and leadership is customer-centric marketing, if you will. So customers and understanding customers is just at the heart, of course, of marketing. But you have some really interesting perspectives on this that I really want our audience to grasp, because you stress the importance of starting with the customer. And so how do you go about deeply understanding your customers to fuel effective storytelling?
The first and rather lame response is to listen to them. It's so easy to look at data and assume that's actually customers, but it's actually the outcomes of what customers do. And I say listen euphemistically because there's many ways to do that. And the reason that's important is because fundamentally to me, marketing is about emotion and influence. So if you can understand your customers inside and out, you can draw real insight that become the fuel for creative expressions that can create the influence and the emotion of storytelling. And if you don't have that, you're just throwing content out there or you're throwing messages out there and the resonance is not going to work. And it's more and more important today in so many different things. Like I was listening to a seminar, with content creators, and they all talk about how it's important to be authentic and how it's their character and their profile that brings value to a brand partner. And it's like, that is all true. Now, it's a microcosm of that reality, but it's a good demonstration of the fact that the connection with that person is the connection that the customer has that they've determined that they want. And if you listen to that understanding and unpick that, you can understand what's actually fueling the customer's connection, desire, passion, love, whatever it is. And then from a marketing point of view, you can create and use our marketing tools to either reflect that, challenge that, or support that. And I think what you have to do is just recognize that there are people, that customers are people, and we have feelings that drive everything first. So if we don't understand why someone does something, or how they react to something, or what influences them, how are we going to do it as marketers? So there's many methods to do that, but I think you've always got to look for what are the most relevant insight that we can then apply through marketing tools to create that relevance and connection with customers.
Love that. And it's nuanced, and to your point, it's just the data is the output of those feelings. And so even digging deeper beyond kind of taking, of course, the data tells a story, but I love your perspective about, okay, but look even further to understand those feelings and that human expression that is showing up in the data. It's interesting. So I'd love to hear a time, if you would describe a time in your career when customer insights significantly influenced a marketing campaign you led. And you could go, of course, a lot of different directions, because I'm sure they always influence to some degree, but I'm curious more so, is there a time where you're headed in a direction with the campaign that you thought it would be, the right one, and then once you learned more or had a change of perspective, once you learned more about what the customer actually wanted, how you shifted? Yeah,
that's a great question. And I think as someone that's always driven pretty much everything I've done in marketing from insight, I have lots of big, small and different examples. And I was actually challenged because it's so synonymous with the way I think. It's almost like what was I thinking? How did we get to that?
Yeah.
One story I do like to use as an illustration of the power of insight is a client that I had some years back in Australia, which was, the brand was known as Yalumba, which is an Indigenous Australian word. Easier for us to say than most other people. Mm-hmm. The Yalumba brand was a wine brand, and it was the oldest family-owned winery in Australia. Okay. And in Australia, you don't know the Australian culture, having a beverage is part of life. It is pretty normal behavior to be a pretty good drinker. And wine industry is huge. And so when I started to work with this client, there were 4,500 brands in Australia in the wine category, which to me was like, that is insane. I can't think of another category where there are so many individual brands. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The other big challenge in the category was that the biggest distributor of wine were these big box warehouses where there were literally thousands of brands of wine in a bottle on a shelf. And so if you think about the competitive landscape for the purchasing environment for wine in the retail environment, it is 100% genericized. You're lying next to your competitors, categorized for consistency to help people navigate through the wines. And therefore, there's the argument about bottle and label design is key, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I looked at that category and that challenge and went, yeah, but if you can get people to have connection before they get to the bottle, how much easier it is for them in that sea of sameness to choose. So how do we get the decision earlier in the process than at the point of sale? And so for me, it was this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful challenge of how do we connect emotionally with customers and be able to then build that into the connection before they get to these decisions. And through our customer research, we had the discovery, which was the core insight, which is quite simply that the act of choosing wine is a strangely shared experience. Wine is often always shared, but there's this other connection that I thought was a weird twist, which is when you go to a restaurant, usually the person that's going to choose the wine says, would you like red or white? Because they're thinking of that sharing engagement first, intuitively. In Australian culture, you don't go to anyone's house without a bottle of wine. Even if you don't drink wine, if you could take a six-pack of beer, but you're going to take a bottle of wine anyway. It's sort of like this strange cultural connection. Again, because you take it to share. And so we drilled in on this idea of the principle of sharing. Mm-hmm. And it's what I would always describe as a category insight, which is the hardest type of insight. It's not a real niche customer insight. It's a category insight. So we understood this category. But then when we looked at it, no one was tackling that in the category. People were not thinking about wine for its power to share. And so we leveraged that insight, and the campaign was executed through some pretty amazing artwork and events and activities and signage and things. But the core line that we used, and this was the headline, the tagline, all combined, but it was quite simply eat, live, laugh, share your lumber. And so the brand became its own tagline. So that was an interesting sort of twist where share your lumber became the tagline and the call to action at the same time. But the premise of eat, live and laugh was to create the atmosphere and the character. When I pitched that campaign to the client, I had to literally say to him, and thankfully, best client ever, because when you own the company and you're the CEO of the company, you can make long-term decisions, a bit unlike a lot of CMOs. A challenge to do. I said to him, this strategy will only work if you will invest for 3 years, which was pretty bold because I was saying, if you don't want to commit for 3 years, we're going to go and do something else because this won't work. They actually committed to it and had double-digit growth after the first year for the next 3 years because we could own the emotion of the purchasing value before we got to the shop. And then there was a whole heap of tactics that went with it, strange tactics around menu placement that we developed through research. Like culturally in Australia, you never want to pick the cheapest wine on the list. You always pick the second. So we created a brand to go first on the list so we could put our premium profitable brand on the second on the list. That way we increased our volume without losing positioning. So there's a whole heap of restructuring strategies that we did to it. But it was all out of that understanding the customer and understanding the idea of sharing. That's a long story, I know, but I think it's really important that it's the little things that can actually break down the bigger challenges.
That's really fascinating too. And to your point, we work a lot with challenger brands here at Door Number 3, the agency that Prentice, my co-host, and I work at in Austin. And we always say that challenger brands have to outthink where they can't outspend. And what I'm hearing in what you're describing is really that outthink component, and you outthink by digging deeper into that human experience. I love that you kind of planted your stake in a behavior that everybody was already participating in and probably had never thought about. For sure, the competitors had not. So it's fascinating. Thank you for that story. Enlightening. So shifting gears now into another core component of your life and leadership, and also our audience, of course, which is creativity and the way that you champion creativity and have in the teams that you've led. And by champion, I more so mean fostering creativity. And so I'm just curious how in the teams, as you reflect on the various multiple teams that you've led, how do you foster a culture of creative expression within your teams?
Yeah, creativity is probably the part of the marketing world I love the most because I'm not very good at it. Because I don't feel like I have a gift, like a craft skill. And the industry has always defined creativity usually by what skill you bring to the table. Can you write? Can you draw? Can you design? And so forth. That's sort of traditionally the way it's been. And I came up through that world. There were the creative teams over there and they're special. And then there's all the marketing teams and the account service teams and the strategy teams, and there's the client. We put everyone in these little boxes. So I'll share with you my probably biggest cliche that I'll give you for this podcast, which is democratize the concept of creativity. It's easier said than done because, in the workplace, people have barriers and we use structure and form and roles and titles to create those things for efficiency and effectiveness. So you're actually trying to break down the barriers, cliche number 2, in that sense, which by nature you put there and we need because they provide efficiency and they give people a sense of place and purpose and connection. But what I found to be useful is to make the cultural connection different. And there's a few different things that I've always encouraged to do that. One is literally get people to bring their passions to work, because quite often we can have amazing passions and talents that no one ever sees at work. You could be an amazing pianist and an incredible business growth person at the same time, and no one would know. But if you brought your ear and your sense of music and that connection to a conversation around a soundtrack for something for a client, it just might make it better. But who would know if you never played piano in the office? or if we didn't have a piano in the office. And I totally guessed the genre correctly. And that's because I'm telepathic. The key thing to me is creating opportunities for that, because it doesn't just happen in the workday. So you actually have to actively create reasons for that to happen, or a premise for that to happen, or some sort of interconnection for that to happen. And then celebrate it. I hate the principle of brainstorming. I think it's a crock. I think it's too hard. Extroverts always win. Introverts always lose. I don't think it actually does anyone any good. But the principle of idea generation is important. The format of how you do that should be flexible and mixed up and all those sorts of things. Some of the best creatives I've ever worked with come up with the best ideas sitting at the coffee shop. It's a cliche, but it's true. It's because they're sitting there just chatting and throwing things around with no fear of failure and no risk. So creating that environment, I think, is good. The other thing I also learned, particularly at Neiman Marcus, where I had a very big creative team, originally a marketing team that was also quite big, and they weren't connected. And working with the creative leaders, we developed what I would say a code for creativity, and particularly in our style, what we were looking for in ideas at Neiman's. And we were literally trying to build some of our brand distinction through a style. And I won't go into the hour dissertation on the challenges of fashion marketing, especially in retail for a multi-brand retailer. But what we did is we looked at our creative work with this concept of juxtaposition as a tool for engagement and differentiation. And we codified that. And we codified it from a conversation where there was an example of an old ad from maybe the 90s, I can't even remember when, that I spotted in the collection of the archives. There was this amazing shot of a model in an outfit walking a llama across a New York street. Can't tell you what she was wearing, but I always remembered the llama because the juxtaposition of a girl walking a llama across a New York street was visually arresting and interesting. And you just say, why? And it brings that connection. So to help all of our creative team and our marketing team connect with what our expectation was, we codified creativity by saying, where's our llama? And because we all knew the backstory to what the llama is something that creates a connection with the customer, that creates something different, that creates a bit of irreverence. And it is definitely a Neiman's thing to do, is to have a llama. So that was a way to codify, which meant the marketing team could talk llama and the creative team could talk llama. Don't even know how llamas talk, but they could all talk llama. And that built a stronger connection, which meant we were now all working creatively.
I love that story for a lot of reasons, because it did kind of take something that was iconic and a core piece of DNA. To your point, it was like the llama is very Neiman Marcus, like the history of just indicative of the way that they've advertised. And I just think it's interesting because you used that piece to bring the teams together and take down some of those silos, to your point of the ways that we kind of organize business. They're necessary. Those walls are helpful, but also finding what's that one anchor kind of shared language that can pull you guys together and start to take some of those silos down. So that's a really neat story. And I'd love to hear an instance where pushing the boundaries of convention led to unexpected success.
I would say probably the most unexpected success I've had in my career was what is known as the Best Job in the World campaign, which we launched out of Australia in 2000 and I'm going to guess 10? Yeah, 2010, January, I think, around there. So that's a couple of years ago. And the interesting thing there was the client challenge was to launch a brand to the world. And it was like, you always want a client to give you a brief. Hey, we want to take this. It was one of my tourism clients, Tourism Queensland, take all the islands of the Great Barrier Reef. So product starting point is pretty good, must admit, pretty amazing place. But everyone knows the Great Barrier Reef and everyone was talking about it being bleached and disappearing. And it wasn't all that positive and it's a long way away from everyone, all those sort of challenges. But they said, but there's all these islands on the reef that are great and you can stay on them and do everything from ecology studies through to just scuba diving or snorkeling or just fine dining. We need to take them to the world. And I said, that's a big challenge and that's great. So what's the budget? And I was like, oh, we've got a really good budget. You've got $1 million. Even back then, $1 million wasn't going to get us a lot because, sometimes in Australia, you do appreciate how big the world is. and we recognized that. But financially, that was a bit of a challenge. So between the meeting with the client and getting back to the office to connect with the teams and share that we've got this great brief and this great opportunity, I had to get away from here's what we've got. And we literally had to take the approach, which is we don't need a big budget. We just need a big idea. And so that was sort of our logic. Gladly, to get to a big idea, you've obviously got to have a big insight to start with. You've got to understand what is going to get people to pay attention to this far-flung place in the other half of the world, too far away, and has every animal in the world that's going to kill you and get people interested. Yeah. And so one of the big insights that we had in our strategy development work was the fact that the Great Barrier Reef is truly paradise. It is an incredibly gorgeous, wonderful place. And we had that in our favour, but we also recognised that there's this strange thing about traveling, which you probably have with your family, is you go somewhere gorgeous and you go, oh, wouldn't it be great to live here? Mm-hmm. And you have that relaxation point and that connection when you're in a destination, not before you go there. It's one of those things that happen whilst you're on vacation, and it's great. But often the reason that never plays out is because you work somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So it's why it's a vacation. You're going there for a short period of time, even though it is, to you, the best place on earth. So that was a big understanding about the challenge that we had, because we had all these other challenges, obviously, the distance and all those other things I mentioned. And the creative team's solution probably came out of both the insight and the problem, which is you only got $1 million, which was literally to run classified ads, which back then was how we applied for jobs. We'd get the newspaper and read the classified ads for the best job in the world, which would be to be a caretaker for these islands. And that, to me, at the time was a really, really big idea because it was so simple. And it broke all the conventions, because to launch a big brand, to launch any brand, you want to go and make a TV commercial. Bigger the better. Spread it as far as you can. Reach as many people. Yeah. Get everyone to fall in love. So it was a totally different thing. And then through the creation of that and building out that program, we broke many other conventions around the leveraging of UGC. And I look at content creators today and I've had conversations with some really good content creators that are amazing about how they got into that world of social influence, etc. And I tell them the story about how this campaign actually unlocked global UGC as campaign content way before these guys even knew what YouTube was. It was the beginning of the change of social marketing and UGC and social content creation that changed the world. And consequently, it won many awards. It delivered huge results for the client. I don't have the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but I think we generated more advertising value than 6 Super Bowl campaigns. No way. With under $1 million. So our cost of the reach, we reached over 1.2 billion people. And I think it was about $700 million worth of advertising value. So the ROI in terms of media value was astronomically big because of the power of leveraging structure, competitive behavior, PR, technology. It was all done digitally because it was global. And then fueling the news cycles like crazy. And there's many, many learnings we had about, the positives and negatives of leveraging news cycles and PR to build a brand, which I will happily leverage for the rest of my life because we learned so much through our CRM program to engage people. The content now is still all over the world, and there's many a case study on that campaign, and it really changed everything we knew about conventional approaches to marketing. And it also changed everything about our agency, our lives, and our careers.
Interesting. And you can't unsee that. It's a new waterline, when you have an experience like that in your career. And to your point, like in other parts of business, there are just best practices and there are in marketing, but that it ultimately is all driven by the results and going outside of the conventional best practices, if you will, where if you had gotten that brief and said, no, sorry, we need to have, X $1 million to deliver this, and said no, then, you wouldn't have experienced this and gotten to see the way that this took shape. So that's kind of the fun of it, isn't it? It's like the risk, and then it's like, but what if it does work? And you have to be a little bit crazy enough to ask that and do it anyways.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I am strangely really don't like best practices. And the reason I don't is because I define them as the average of what yesterday's best was. And I don't think that's grounds for being great.
Yeah.
And so I'm a bit of a cynic at times with those sorts of things. And that's probably why I'm open to breaking convention. And, even at Neiman Marcus, one of the things that all the marketing team used to know was every time we were looking at a seasonal new campaign, that everyone had to bring me something that was going to scare me. If I'm not scared, we're not pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
Because it's so much easier to bring a big, scary idea back than it is to push one too. So let's start with what we can't do. Let's start with what we don't believe is possible, and then we can bring it into the world of reality. So I think, to me, those things sometimes I think we let the books of good business practices and marketing that are on the shelves behind me dictate our definition of things versus be the baseline and then go and find a whole new baseline.
Love that. I'm going to be taking that away with me, a unique perspective on best practices, but it's the only way that you drive things forward. It's incredible. So I want to shift into another passion topic of yours, because you have a mantra around just creating worlds of immersive experiences. So something you've said that I love is that we care more about the shit that happens to us than the stuff that we hear about, watch, or read. And creating a connected ecosystem of storytelling, rich in experience, creates the most powerful brand connections and value. And you've lived this, and I'm just interested with that mantra, how you've implemented this approach with the X Games in particular. I'd love to hear that story and how that mantra probably came to be through those experiences. But tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. And one of the earlier things I got to work on when I came to the US, which was great. So I was working with a whole new team, totally weird market that was very strange to me at first, which gladly adapted to. But when you think about the X Games, the financial model for the X Games was not getting people to the events, even though they were famous for them. And they had some amazing, talented athletes, stars and personalities. And they ran big events in different parts of the world. That was not the revenue stream. Okay. The revenue stream was broadcast. And X Games was then owned by ESPN. And so it was about broadcast. And broadcast is driven by ad revenue, which means essentially getting more eyeballs onto the content in the broadcast platform. And so recognizing that's the fundamental goal, our brief was to how do we better engage the fans of X Games with our content. And so the easy thing is Pinnacle is your event. The Pinnacle was who's watching and what are they doing while they're watching. So how can we make that experience like you're at the event? Because that's the aspiration. There's pretty sure no kid watching X Games that wouldn't wish they were there. Can't always do that. But how can we get them closer to that experience? And then we started to understand their behavior and their engagement a lot. And what we ended up developing was, it seems strangely simple now, but we developed the first companion app for live broadcast.
Oh, wow.
And the interesting dimension was how could we cross over the world of the fans that are watching the live broadcast with the actual live event. So the core premise of the app was not to create functionality for the broadcast or to be able to do something different or just have information, but it was to create real engagement. So we created two really interesting characteristics inside that platform that, interestingly, ESPN actually went and got patents for because they thought they were really, really cool tech evolutions. The first one was literally a fan experience where you could shake your phone and generate an energy score that would then be broadcast during the live event.
Oh, interesting.
So it was like literally cheering or applauding at an event. The the people at the event are going to know. And when people cheer at an event, the broadcast shares that back with you, but there's no way to give anything back.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that. So that was one of the characteristics that we did. The other one was super difficult from a tech platform perspective, but we managed to pull it off for a couple of their events. And there was the reality that when you're watching the event live, mm-hmm. it's really hard to know what these athletes do. Like if you see them go on the half bike and they just literally do 4 spins and 3 twists and everything else, it's like they do it so quickly. It's like, what happened? So what we developed was a digital version of the technology or the technology of the athletes' tricks. And it was called Trick Tracker. So it would give you a visual graph of what was happening on the half pipe, and each of their lifts off the lip, it would tell you what they did. And so you could have that whilst you're listening to the broadcast, watching TV. You could have your little guide of actually what are they doing in front of you on your phone at the same time. So it was a complementary evolution of the information that was broadcast to you. And the whole idea here, going back to the business goal, more eyeballs longer, we created such huge engagement with our fans by using the app and making the broadcast a richer experience. The numbers of the ad revenue went through the roof. And it was because we weren't just watching, we knew who was watching, we were engaging with them.
Right.
The people buying the advertising, the partnerships could see the value, and we had our fans watching more and engaging more. So we closed that ecosystem. Now, bringing that back to the storytelling, the story of the athletes and their brilliance, and that's coming through. But when now you can actually participate, you're part of the live experience through a digital environment. So that's the sort of an example of the principles applied to real engagement.
Interesting. And back to the human experience and those customer insights. Yeah, it's that person on the couch, what are they feeling? They're feeling FOMO. They wish they were in the room. And so you were able to strike that hot, spot in their heart. That's really, really fascinating. Well, as we get ready to wrap up, I am so enjoying what you've shared, these stories, and just the way that you tie in all of these threads that are real daily experiences and kind of pain points for our audience. So thank you for your just holistic perspective in that. And as a consultant and advisor in this current chapter that you're in, I'd love to hear what are some common challenges you see brands facing today, and how do you advise them to overcome these hurdles, just broadly, and then we'll wrap up here.
Every instance to me is different, and you have to literally pull it apart and get to the root of the problem and the root of the opportunity. I am seeing plenty of challenges for CMOs out there, but I think the things that are underlying those challenges is that change, how to live in a world of perpetual change. I think that's one that sometimes can be overwhelming for people and for organizations, and not having that structure and consistency. So I'm seeing a lot of organizations trying to work out, what does my marketing team need to look like? What skills do we need? How do we approach those sorts of things? Then there's how do we deal with AI? Like it's some sort of tidal wave coming over us. It's going to drown us all, which it's not. I don't know what it's going to do for us all, but that's certainly not the problem. So I think, how do you maximize those opportunities and remain competitive while building a brand? I see so many brand missteps, not through anyone's individual incompetence, just by reality. And I'm not talking about doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing. It's about maybe over-investing in the wrong thing, not leveraging, the principles of how you get customers from awareness through to purchase, and, spamming everyone all the time, or thinking you have something personal and you don't, or just being totally irrelevant to everyone. Those sorts of things, when you sit back and you're not working in a brand and you're curious and you're looking at everything and watching lots of stuff and reading lots of stuff, you see these things all the time. So I think they're all challenges we deal with. That is marketing. It's driven by humans, which are unpredictable. We do research with humans who are unpredictable, therefore results are unpredictable. Right. We use data that's aggregated and averaged, which makes it a little bit, unpredictable and hard to read. and we're trying to create influence. It's not the easiest thing to achieve. So I think we're all challenged in different ways, and we will continue to be, because that is marketing and that's the best part of it.
So well said. And what a perfect bow to tie at the end of this conversation. And Daz, thank you so much. Thanks for being with us, and just your wealth of experience and perspective is, I know, going to add so much value. It has to me personally, but just to everyone listening. So thank you for your time and for sharing your perspective with us.
You're welcome. It was fantastic to have this conversation with you.